ADHD stands for Attention Deficit Hyperactive Disorder. In 2011, about 11% of children ages 4 to 17, or 6.4 million children, have been diagnosed with ADHD. Out of all boys, 13.2% were more likely to have ADHD. For all girls, 5.6% were more likely to have ADHD as well. Author Dr. Daniel Amen states that having ADHD is just like people who need glasses. People who need glasses aren't dumb, crazy, or stupid. Their eyeballs are shaped funny. They need help getting focused. Now, what exactly is ADHD? According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, it is a neurobehavioral disorder that affects both children and adults. The CDC defines neurobehavioral as the way the brain affects emotion, behavior, and learning. There is no known cause of ADHD, but research shows that genetics, environmental factors, and brain injuries do play a large role in the disorder. There was also a common belief that sugar and food additives caused ADHD, but this was disproven in 1982. So no, feeding people too much sugar will not give them ADHD, but they will be a little more hyperactive. Now, let's take a look at that squishy mess inside our skulls, the brain. Areas of the brain that are affected by ADHD are the prefrontal cortex, controlling thoughts, judgments, and conscious decisions, the striatum, controlling smooth bodily movement, the basal ganglia, controlling cognition and motor function, and the cerebellum, controlling voluntary movement and balance. These areas are also smaller than those in a brain without ADHD by about 5%. But this doesn't mean that a person has decreased intelligence. These different areas of the brain are important in diagnosing ADHD because they all control attention, social judgment, and movement. Newly developed scans such as positron emission tomography, or PET scans, help confirm the ADHD diagnosis. PET scans create a three-dimensional image to see what parts of the brain are active. However, these tests are extremely costly, and most insurance companies will not cover the expenditures. For this reason, many individuals rely on their physician's expertise to recognize the symptoms and diagnose ADHD. Unfortunately, about half of the individuals that have ADHD go through life undiagnosed due to fears of medication side effects and the denial of having the disorder. Another intriguing fact about the disorder is that about 30 to 60% of individuals diagnosed with ADHD are comorbid. The word comorbid is a medical term for secondary conditions, meaning, on top of having ADHD, the individual also has a disorder such as schizophrenia, depression, Tourette's, obsessive-compulsive disorder, bipolar disorder, anxiety disorder, and possibly learning disorder. Next, we will organize the types of ADHD. In general, no person fits a single type of ADHD perfectly. Therefore, there are numerous types. But let's stick with the three most common. One type of ADHD is the predominantly inattentive type. A person with this form of ADHD is easily distracted and has difficulty in concentration, organization, and has forgetfulness. Winnie the Pooh is a perfect example of this type of ADHD. He is very airheaded, has to think in order to remember tasks, and always changes the topic to his love of honey. The most stereotyped form of ADHD is the predominantly hyperactive impulsive type. A person is constantly moving, has difficulty staying on task, interrupts during conversation, and is restless and impatient. Tigger fits perfectly in this category because of his bouncing behavior and jumps into any conversation with his friends. With the combination type, a person has both types of ADHD, but symptoms may vary and no one symptom is predominant. Rabbit is the epitome of this type of ADHD. Rabbit is constantly hyper-focused on his garden and always likes to take charge in every situation. He can be quite bossy at times, but has no intentions of being genuinely mean. To be considered a diagnosed case of ADHD, the symptoms of it must disrupt daily function and life overall. Everyone has experienced minor symptoms of ADHD at least once in their life. However, the symptoms must indicate that the individual is impaired. There are many common misconceptions about ADHD. some of which are that ADHD isn't real. Many people believe that ADHD is not a real disorder and that the individual can stop it at any given time. Many people that do not have ADHD feel that ADHD is an excuse for the inability to control their own behavior. However, ADHD is a real disorder and there is no cure for it. Another common misconception about ADHD is that it only affects children. ADHD is most commonly found in children, but it can also occur during adulthood. If there is any trace of ADHD in the family, then it will most likely be passed down. From the moment a person with ADHD is born, the disorder remains throughout their lifetime. There is also a skewed misconception that ADHD changes your personality. Although ADHD affects behavior and learning, it does not change personality in any way. ADHD does not change the uniqueness of an individual. The reason why ADHD appears to affect personality is that sometimes individuals try to mask who they are because of their disorder. One of the biggest misconceptions about ADHD is that it worsens over time. ADHD is not a degenerative disease like Asperger's, and it will not lead to impairment of vital functions either. And no, it's not contagious like the common cold, so rest assured, you'll be all right. Now, how is ADHD treated? Treatments for ADHD include medication, psychotherapy, physical activity, or different combinations of all therapies. Currently, the most effective form of treating ADHD is prescribed medication. The two types of drugs are stimulants and non-stimulants, such as antidepressants and high blood pressure medications. ADHD stimulants such as Ritalin, Concerta, Adderall, Vyvanse, and Focalin increase the amount of dopamine in the brain. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter that is commonly known as the body's pleasure chemical. Treating hyperactivity with a stimulant may seem counterintuitive, but by increasing the amount of dopamine in the brain, there's an increase in attention and focus, thus reducing the amount of hyperactivity. Non-stimulants such as Strattera, Aplazin, Wellbutrin, Zyban, and Catapres are not only used to treat ADHD, but they can also be used to treat depression. Psychotherapy can also be helpful and can be used in conjunction with medication. Physical activity is known as an alternative to medication. Exercise not only improves health, but for a person with ADHD, it also helps with focus and attention. When performing physical activity, the body releases hormones called endorphins that regulate pleasure, emotion, and pain. Endorphins, as well as other chemicals such as dopamine, are increased, which gives the individual a certain high. Famous athletes, artists, writers, political figures, actors, actresses, musicians, scientists, inventors, philosophers. The list goes on. These are the faces of the most influential and most well-known people, and they all have one thing in common: ADHD. The only reason why they are famous is because they did not allow their ADHD to control them. Rather, they let it guide them onto the path they decided to choose. They never gave up in their endeavors, and with their hyper-focus, they were able to remain passionate about what interested them the most.
Hi, I'm Mr. Leroux. I teach Spanish and previously French, and currently also English as a second language. As a teacher for many years, I've had a lot of students who have ADHD. And so I've always tried to have some type of idea of what should I expect and how I can organize my classroom in such a way that would make things more conducive for their learning styles. I really didn't understand everything that was going on until my oldest grandson was diagnosed with ADHD while he was in kindergarten. And so we started taking him to Children's Memorial Hospital in Chicago, and they, did the evaluation and decided that he did have ADHD. So part of the treatment was for him to attend classes on behavior management. And while he was in these classes, there were also classes for the parents or caregivers of the child, so that we could share our stories, share with what works, what doesn't work, and there would be experts in different fields, whether it be medication, behavior modification, or things of that nature that could teach us and show us, give us some tools on how to best handle the situation. One of the more interesting things was the relationship between ADHD and heredity. And so after thinking about this for a while, historically it's been usually considered a boys situation, where it was boys that had ADHD. And so therefore the symptoms, the manifestations of that become rather well known. You get to recognize it in the classroom. What wasn't known at the time was how ADHD manifests itself in girls. And it's not always the hyperactivity. Frequently it's kind of the opposite. It's very quiet, but still the inability to organize and to focus. So later, after finding out more about his situation, it became obvious that his mother also had ADHD, but we never knew it as she was growing up, and therefore she never got treatment for it. Because we do have custody of our grandson, we've had to reorganize the way we look at raising children to make sure that we are doing things that are best suited for him. Giving a routine, making sure that there's not changes in his style, monitoring his schoolwork and other things to make sure that he's following through, but at the same time making sure that he isn't feeling weird, left out, different, that he's still loved and he is what he is. On the other hand, if we had known 30 years ago what we know now, we would have sought treatment and known what to expect when his mother was going through school, but we didn't. So we thought it was just poor adolescent behavior. It's the constant battle to make sure he focuses and thinks about what he needs to do, and follows through with what he needs to do for school. We haven't had much problem up to this point with risky behavior, which is also another one of the symptoms. Especially in girls, people aren't familiar with the manifestations. They don't know what to look for, what it is. It's frequently confused with typical adolescent behavior and things of that nature, and people don't see it as actually being ADHD. Not to be stereotypical, but like for girls, it's frequently, oh, they're just so ditzy, and that's a typical reaction to the situation, where in reality there is something more going on there that needs to be addressed. I can't feel negative about it. It's not that the person has a choice. It's just the way they are. My sister has Down syndrome, so I've been exposed to people, her especially, who I have to accept them as they are and not how I would like them to be. And this is all through no fault of their own, that they all have their positives, there are a lot of benefits, a lot I can learn and have learned because of this. It's made me a better person.
Hi, my name is Paul Carnezis. I'm a father of 2 children, both of whom have ADHD, and I also have it as well. ADHD has affected my life in more ways than I care to recount. From a young age, I was always very impetuous, very rambunctious, they used to call me, and exceedingly hyperactive. After my children were both diagnosed, I began to suspect something, because we had learned a little bit about ADHD, and we had learned that Some of the things and mannerisms that my children had sort of reminded me of myself. Looking back now, as an adult with ADHD, I'm able to think back of what happened to me when I was a child and some of the issues that I had, things that happened to me, and draw some parallels to the things that have happened to my children. I've struggled with ADHD from a young age. Unbeknownst to me, I had it and was suffering from it, but actually for me it became more or less that's just my nature, that's the way I was, and that's the way it was going to be. I've overcome some of those things because I've learned to live with it. And that's what I think most children really eventually need to do once they make it to adulthood, is they mature and they figure out ways of working through their ADHD and I guess circumventing their shortcomings, their shortfalls. I've done that by surrounding myself with people that can assist me in various ways. My assistants at the office, they engage, they take care of things that I need them to take care of, and it's become second nature for them as well. They are also, I guess you would call them, victims of ADHD because they have to deal with me and my idiosyncrasies. It's a bit difficult to put into words, but when you suffer from ADHD, you have difficulty keeping on task, sort of like looking into this camera right now. You have to keep on task. You've got to find an interest in things that you don't truly have an interest in, and as you can imagine, educationally, it becomes somewhat of a difficult thing and not quite second nature. So it's kind of hard to study when you don't find an interest in something. I always had to find myself trying to find a way to become or to find something captivating or exciting in order to make it interesting, because if it wasn't interesting, I just wasn't going to have any interest in it whatsoever. In my work life, I had to find myself in a profession where I was able to surround myself with people that would be able to help, people that take on menial tasks, things that I'm easily bored with. I can go ahead and assign those off to others that need to take care of those things, so I can engage myself with the items at hand that are necessarily most important to myself and or my client. I'm not one to run and hide from something. If there is an issue that somebody has, it's best to work through it. I've always felt that. ADHD is not life-threatening. It's life-altering. It can be helped. It can be treated. I don't think that anybody can actually cure somebody of it. I know I haven't been cured. I'm still a child at hand. But it's not a debilitating disease by any stretch. And I don't think that there should be a stigma attached to it. I don't believe there really is. I think if anything, it gives you something to overcome. And once you overcome it, and you're able to live with it, it's there. And it just doesn't matter. It's almost like someone who has learned to get along without a limb. Somebody with a congenital defect. You don't use it as an excuse, you overcome it.
At around the age of 3, my younger brother Nathan was very hyperactive and had major anger management issues. He would throw his toys and was easily frustrated, but after seeing how Nathan was acting far from normal, our parents took him to a specialist in Chicago to find out what was wrong. My parents also brought me along just to check as well. And so after a series of tests, we were both diagnosed with ADHD. We were both given medication to combat our different symptoms as well. At first, we didn't know what ADHD even was, but when we grew older, we started struggling with social, emotional, and academic problems. My brother didn't even speak his first words until he was 4.5. He had to go through years of remedial speech and language classes because he struggled to even say his R's correctly. Although both of my parents struggled with the hard work and the patience needed to overcome my brother's difficulties, my mother shares a personal account about what ADHD means to her.
My name is Kathy Karnezis, and I'm a wife and a mother, and my whole family has ADHD but me. My son Nathan has ADHD. He wouldn't be my Nathan without the energy of the H. He's always been on the move. We've learned that together through everyday situations and everyday places, like the grocery store. Grocery stores can be very perilous when traveling with an ADHD child. When Nathan was very small, he wanted everything to go in the grocery cart with him. When he became a little bit older, he was especially fond of the frozen food section. Those were the extra wide aisles for him that had no displays. He kind of thought he was at NASCAR, rubbing up the cart, running down the aisle, making sure I lost him now and again. We definitely have a lot of good memories at the grocery store. Before Nathan could talk, I kind of looked at him as Mr. Personality. He would wave to just about anyone. As he got older, he started all the conversations with strangers about the weather. He'd talk about food, his treats, whatever came to mind. I received a lot of compliments on the nice, polite little young man I was raising. I was thinking to myself inside, oh my gosh, little did they know how hard it was to get him to stand still, or the fact that he took forever to speak. I look now back at all his rambunctiousness, and I keep in mind that he's always been thoughtful, no matter how this ADHD came into his life. We were at a store, of course, one time, and watched him walk up to an old lady, and he was just, without thought, went up and took the cart, pushed her through the checkout lane, because that was the right thing to do. So now as I look back, and he's turning 14 soon, I have to say that, for the most part, he has been a wonderful son. I look at that personality, I see how he charms the cashiers, I see how he helps me, just everyday things, even purchases that I made, he's got to be the first one to carry them. It is an adventure, it was an adventure, and the adventure is still there, but I think I appreciate the journey more. Even when I wind up paying for more than I thought I was going to for that excursion, because living with this boy and ADHD has brought a lot of humor and experiences into our home, and I definitely have to admit that our life is short of dull.
My name is Rebecca Karnezis, and I'm a daughter, a sister, and I have ADHD. I was about 8 at the time before my diagnosis, and I was a happy child who was constantly spacing out during class and in public. I hyper-focused on the simplest things and was easily distracted. Birthday parties were terrible for me because they were too many people and too much chaos going on. My brain was always moving on to the next task, and I had no filter when I opened my mouth. I spoke my mind more back then than I do now. I always had trouble with linear thinking. By that I mean my thoughts didn't have a beginning, middle, and an end like most people. I always jumped into right now. I never seemed to stay on task, but I didn't get frustrated because I didn't understand what was really going on. Moving on to middle school, I was going through many hormonal changes just like any other girl, which affected my emotions and my self-esteem. Little did I know these so-called normal pre-teenage issues were exacerbated by my medication. Now, the middle school years are known as the years where you try to find out who you are. In all honesty, I had no clue who I was. Because I was older, I understood more and realized I was different and feared letting people know something was wrong with me. On top of worrying about what I wore, what group I was a part of, basically everything any preteen can judge you for, I had something that people would label me as stupid or weird. And so, I constantly kept to myself, keeping an arm's distance. The biggest mistake that I made was not trusting people to accept me for who I am. If I was a part of any major social situation, I would sometimes sit there quietly, not because I was antisocial, but because I didn't know how to make sense out of what I was thinking. When I did open my mouth, I would just blurt out things that seemed weird because I didn't want to forget what popped up. That was when I decided that I would save all myself the embarrassment and bottle up all of my jumbled words. By doing this, I nearly allowed my ADHD to take over my social life completely. I didn't even know who I was anymore. I became a quiet, introverted, and insecure person, and a stranger to myself. I fought the urge to smile, to laugh, and acknowledge people in my presence, so I would bring no attention to myself at all. I became extremely negative and believed with all my heart that no one would ever understand me. It wasn't until 7th grade that I decided to make a change. I looked to find an outlet for my built-up frustration and soon discovered running. It took me a while to see myself as an athlete. I constantly forgot to tie my shoes, know when I had meets, where my uniform was, and to this day I'm still directionally challenged and can't find my way out of a paper bag. But I didn't let all that get to me. I just knew that the more I ran, the more focused I became. Once I realized I needed to take control and design a way that helped me, I started to believe asking for help was okay. Academically, I was still, and still am, an overachiever who could not accept my limitations. My stubbornness to do everything by myself and not look weak started to become my downfall. I knew I was studying, I knew I had the information, but my frustration levels finally took a turn when I realized that my brain would not allow me to access the information on demand. It was like a library full of all the resources, but nothing was alphabetized. For the average person without ADHD, they already remember where the books are. I start over every time, forgetting where to begin. When I realized it took more steps for me to express my knowledge, I wanted to be able to prove that my hard work was measured properly, and so for the first time in my life, I finally asked for help. I now look back, and I see that all the years struggling alone were foolish and completely stupid. Once I became involved with more activities that interest me, I found ADHD didn't have such a hold on me. Music, theater, and art all became other ways to express myself, and I realized that hyperfocus can exist in everyone who has a passion for what they love. I realized that ADHD did not mean something was wrong with me. Rather, it meant something was right. I soon felt extremely confident in my abilities and accepted that ADHD isn't a curse. I now have the courage and the confidence to tell people my story, and I'm not ashamed of who I am. I leave you with some final thoughts and hope that the next time you meet someone with ADHD, you will recognize the wonderful aspects about them. Remember, this hyper-focused person is the one to help you move that mountain. Remember, this person is overly sensitive enough to care and have a shoulder to lean on. Remember, this person is like everyone else, struggling to fit in. Remember, at the very least, this is a person who you can laugh through all the goofy ways an ADHD person sees the world. Oh, and I forgot. You might have to remind us more than once about what time to be there for you.